This video is within fair use under YouTube's fair use and copyright guidelines. Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy was developed by Raven Software and Vicarious Visions and published by LucasArts, Activision, Microsoft and Aspyr. If the content featured in this video significantly interests you, then please support the official release. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new installment of what I haven't really done for a very long time, although that kind of seems to be a repeating phrase a lot on this show and channel in general, is a game review, and this time it's of a real cracker from 2002, Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy. Now this came out in about 2002-2003 for multiple different platforms including PC, PlayStation and Xbox, and it's an absolute steal, regarded as one of the finest games in the Star Wars franchise and as a perfect follow-up to the original Star Wars Jedi Knight and its sequel Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast. Now this is a bit of a different kettle to fish to its predecessor Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, because Jedi Outcast is a much more progressively sort of based game in that you take a lot more time to progress from each different stage of getting a new kind of sort of power up and a new kind of setup in each individual chapter of the game, and you know that is done much more quickly in Jedi Academy than Jedi Outcast, so you have to keep in mind that this is a slightly easier and slightly more forgiving game than Outcast, although in some places that will most certainly not appear to be the case. Now this is a game wherein customization doesn't appear to play an enormous part in the appearance and application of the game mechanics, but it does help create a sense of uniqueness to your own experience of the game, in that while the narrative of the single player game is always the same and the dialogue and actions in multiplayer are always the same, you can create your own character with your own colour scheme and fighting style that allows you to formulate your own personal experience of it. You make your experience of Jedi Knight Jedi Academy unique to what you prefer. And that's really what I think is the greatest strength of this game, is the customization of it. It's not really an overt part of the game, but it really does impact quite significantly from behind the scenes. And if you really want to get a taste of how it works, you should always start with the multiplayer. I mean, the multiplayer to this day still has a massively strong community, just as with Jedi Outcast. So I definitely give recommendation to trying that out first, before the single player. But for this review, we'll first of all be taking a little bit of a look at the single player and just seeing what kind of shit we can get up to. Now, of course, the point at which any review should start when you're regarding a single player campaign's startup is, of course, the initial screen you'll come onto when you click a new game. You've also got the options to edit your controls and setup. When you start up, of course, you have the option between 4 different levels of difficulty, and they're all quite varied. Then after that you come to this screen here, where you can pick between several different races, including Twi'lek, human, and a few others, including Rodans and a couple of other different races such as that. The bodies for male sort of skins are a little bit more varied than the female ones, but at the same time the customization for each one is quite significant, as there is at least 4 different customizations for your head, torso and legs on most of the character models. Then of course for each one there is also several different colour schemes you can choose. As you can see here, I picked a human male and decided to go with a nice splash of red to go with the general bloodiness of the work of a Jedi in the days post Fall of the Empire, because after all this is of course set several years after the fall of the Empire in Star Wars Episode 6. After all, the last game, Jedi Knight Jedi Outcast, was set only a few years after the fall of the Empire and follows the adventures of Kyle Katarn. You come to know quite a fair bit actually throughout the story of this game. Yeah, that's right, the playable character in the previous game is now the main character to, give you exposition and assistance in this game, essentially your main support character. Now, as you finish customizing your your Jedi, well, how else do I put it, but your Jedi Academy graduate, you're given the choice of picking what kind of colour and style of lightsaber you want. Now, at first, on the single player, unlike on the multiplayer, you're not really given a massive choice in styles of how to fight and what kind of lightsabers you want, in regards to having a single lightsaber, having dual single lightsabers, or having a double-edged bladed lightsaber. So there's a little less combination and customization in terms of that when you start up the single player. However, it more than makes up for it for what is quite possibly one of the most pulse-pounding intros to a video game single player that I've seen from any game of this kind in the early 2000s, because keep in mind, cutscenes and the such and graphics were still reasonably primitive around 2002-2003, but this introduction really does bring a little bit of sort of fire and heart to the Star Wars franchise. It has the same wonderment as the Star Wars franchise, but also brings in an element of, added danger, because you're being thrusted into a sudden dangerous occasion on your way to the Jedi Academy on Yavin, and of course you really don't want to get into any significant danger when you've only just started to learn how to be a Jedi. Now, of course, as you can see here, we've got a first couple of few little missions and objectives to do, the first of which is to get through this valley to the Jedi Academy with Rash, your main companion, throughout the first couple of missions. Now, I should mention that while you're fighting with a lightsaber, there are a few ways to go about things. One is, of course, just to click the left mouse button or control, which will commonly just issue a standard swing. Depending on how you're moving and what kind of fighting style you have with your lightsabers and what kind of lightsaber you have in regards to whether or not you have a single-bladed one, a double-bladed, two-handed lightsaber, or, a pair of single-handed lightsabers, the amount of fighting and speed at which you can do is varied quite significantly. The main difference, however, is in the special attacks you can command, which is commonly done when you hold down both mouse buttons while standing still, or do a significant and precise routine of actions in regards to your movement and the correspondence of the combat situation with which you are in, and what kind of lightsaber and what kind of fighting style you have. The further you get into the single player, the more combinations and customizations you can have with your character. It's more immediate really during the multiplayer when you log into a server where you can immediately customize your character to really have any kind of appearance in regards to the game's skins and customization options. And that's really where you'll probably end up spending most of your time, because the multiplayer does have slightly more replayability. The first port of call maybe should be the first player if you really want to get to grips with the basic mechanics of the game, as it kind of eases you more and more into the mechanics of the game at a steadier pace, whereas of course with the multiplayer, considering all the mechanics are there and available right at the beginning, it's kind of dropping you in the deep end, really, so to speak. That's kind of a bit of a problem with the online, but at the same time you could say that really of any kind of online with any game, really, so I wouldn't criticise it too heavily in this game. But regardless, the customization in this game does more than make up for it. After all, like I said, one of the main things that you will be drawn into this game is how many ways you can play it. Whether or not you remove all the skill points from your lightsaber skills in order to become a pure soldier, or whether you decide to be Master Swordsman. It's really up to you, to be honest, and it's quite beautiful how much customization there is, and how much that makes up for the now quite badly aged graphics and dialogue. I'm not gonna lie, one of the main problems I have with this game nowadays is the fact that the graphics and the dialogue are severely outdated. But to be fair, for the time when this was made, circa 2002 or 2003, this was pretty high state. This was pretty, high grade in terms of gaming art and capabilities. And I'm not gonna lie, when I first played this game years and years and years ago, I was massively impressed. Even still now, I'm still kind of impressed as to how much they achieved with this game in regards to the technology that was available at the time. Because keep in mind, this was released right at the earlier years of the PlayStation 2 era, right at the beginning of or around the end of the first third of that era or so. It was pretty damn impressive for that time. And keep in mind, a lot of games still were using an isometric or 2D view at this time, and it was only really at this kind of point where we started to move towards third-person action games like this. And of course there were some that had moved away from the traditional gaming formula several years before, what with the release of consoles like the PlayStation 1 and N64. But there was really very few things like this at the time when it was released, and I really have to admire it for what it's achieved since then, spawning a good few more, spin-offs and keeping interest alive in what was, at the time, probably not one of the biggest spin-offs of any Star Wars game. Keep in mind, this spun off the Star Wars Knights, Star Wars Jedi Knight game, and that in of itself was a spin-off of Dark Forces. And in between Dark Forces and Star Wars Jedi Knights, Knights of the Old Republic, this kind of ended up getting a bit forgotten, which I find to be a bit sad, because Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy are two of the more applicable and, dare I say, accessible games in terms of customer friendliness and, user friendliness in the vast pantheon of Star Wars games. So I definitely recommend giving it a pick up, because it's more than worth it in regards to, if you just want to get into something quickly, but then be, of course, given an increasingly difficult set of tasks at a steady rate. And that is one thing this game more that excels at. Now, once you've gotten past the lightsaber combat, which will take quite a while to master, don't worry, you're going to die a lot at first on the multiplayer, and it will take you a bit of clunkling and fiddling about how to get round to it in the single player. You should most likely reckon next of most, or secondly reckon next of most, the force powers, which you can select by pressing Q or E to toggle around them, and then letting go of the Q or E keys to just let the game pick the power that you have settled on. Now, of course, you can add this in the profile customization section in the force powers bit when you press escape, so do keep that in mind. You don't have to always adhere to the same kind of force powers as you might sort of think you have to. It's a bit more customizational in the multiplayer. However, at the end of each mission in single player, you will be allowed to give 1 point to one of the force powers you have, and there are several that are neutral, several that are light, and a few that are dark. The dark ones particularly being things like lightning, drain, and rage and stuff like that, with the light powers, of course, being things like absorb, heal, and sense, with the neutral ones being more things to do with just general purpose sort of actions, such as pull, speed, things like that. And so if you want to customize it, it's probably a little bit more easier to do in the multiplayer, where you can just kind of do it a bit more willy-nilly, and at the start of each round it sets to the precedence you just put it to. In the single player, you have to be a bit more wiser and careful with the points that you spend on which force powers. It works in kind of a similar way to the Star Wars Episode 3 movie tie-in game, in that you pick a power to apply the points that you've earned to, and you can't really change it massively until the end of the next mission. And after you've spent that particular point on that particular power, you can't change it back. So be very wise with how you spend your points on force powers in the single player, because God only knows you're going to need them later on down the line. And it is a little bit pandering, I'm not going to lie, how it shows you how to use the force powers at first in the single player, but trust me, it's worth it, because it's actually quite a good introduction on how to use several of the more basic ones, and thus in turn you'll be, of course, introduced to more of the more developed ones later down the line. Now, I suppose really the main aspect of what people might ask me about when I'm showing footage of the single player is, well, what is the single player like? And the single player is a bit of a strange one, because like I said, the cutscenes, the graphics and the dialogue are a bit clunky, but like I said, for the time this was made in, it was still very, very impressive, and the story itself is remarkably simple, but also quite enveloping, because it shows that in the sort of era just after the fall of the Empire, the Republic is not safe. You know, you have to be thrust into this dastardly era of subterfuge and cultist activity, and it's really quite an interesting sort of narrative that you have to create your own character and build him from the ground up, or her from the ground up, if you will, depending on which character skin you pick. And while you might customise your appearance and the way that you fight, you don't actually customise the dialogue. Now, this was of course a bit of a thing before customisable dialogue trees were a thing. They had been of course introduced a bit by games such as Deus Ex, which was released a couple of years before this, but it's still a interesting way to approach a narrative. You know, your character might always have the same attitude and the same disposition on certain moral issues within the story, but it's quite an interesting thing to see that your character has their own sort of appearance that you crafted. So you could still make the argument that it's more than, you know, applicable to get a lot of investment into the story of this game because of how much you are able to customise your character. Now, as you can see, after the end of each mission, you get a screen like this which shows how many laser kills, how many lightsaber kills you got, and will just generally show you the kind of general stats of what you did after each mission. Now, this is where the main bit of the first-person game is done. Each chapter of the mission is told through 5, 4 or 6 about roughly so missions on different planets where different objectives are placed, and it provides you with a good bit of flexibility in regards to the fact that if you find a certain mission quite difficult, you can go back and do one over again, or if you find one a bit too hard, you can go away, practice on some of the other missions and complete them first before coming back to tackle this one. As you can see here, I'm deciding to do a cultist activity mission on Corellia, and as you can see here, this is the stage where you upgrade your force powers. In the middle you have 6 neutral ones, on the left you have 4 light side ones, and on the right you have 4 dark side ones. This is where you have to really be wise with your decision, because otherwise you're going to mess yourself up later on in the game. Now, first of all, I would recommend upgrading the lightning and health abilities, because they are probably the ones you're going to use the most in single player, and I would very much adhere to that. However, entirely it's up to you, but take my word for it, upgrade your health first. Now, at the start of each mission as well, you will also be given a choice of a couple of different firearms and one different explosive from a selection of about 3 or 4, and you'll unlock more firearms as the further you go on into the game. The first off few weapons that you get is, of course, the E11 blast rifle, which is the standard weapon throughout the game. Then you've got the sniper rifle here, which you can charge up to fire extremely powerful shots in scope mode. The EMP rifle, which does a lot of damage against droids and vehicles, but not much against humans. And then the Wookiee bowcaster, which, of course, if you've watched the films and played games such as Battlefront 2, you know how vicious that bastard can be, especially when it actually kind of acts weirdly enough like the plasma pistol from Time Splitters in this game. It really is a great weapon. Now, I should mention that in lightsaber mode you are in third person, but in first person shooting mode is, you know, what comes into play when you go into selecting one of your guns. Now, I'm just showing you this bit of footage here to show what the first person shooting action looks like. As you saw there with that first enemy, I killed him with a charged up shot on the pistol. Most guns in the game have 2 modes. They have a standard fire and a special shot. With the pistol, I did the special shot by holding down the right trigger and then letting go to release an extra powerful laser blast. With the E11 rifle, the special shot, of course, is rapid fire, whereas with the, standard shot, it's, of course, as you can see, just a semi-automatic shot. With the standard fire, it's, of course, the left mouse button. So, feel free to experiment with the different weapons and, maybe do that in, multiplayer, because, to be honest with you, ammo and health can come quite scarcely sometimes in certain missions in single player, so you don't want to screw yourself up over and then find you have to fight off 3 Mark III Dark Trooper droids and then end up getting yourself promptly wrecked. So I think that's really all I can say about the base game mechanics. There's a lot of customization to be had, and there's a lot of, different ways to play the game between first and third person mode. And I must also mention that unlike, say, the Battlefront series, you can't really change between first and third person mode when you're using guns, and you also can't change from third person mode, when you're using a lightsaber, so just keep that in mind. There are a few other little bits and bobs that I'll leave up to you guys to find out when you play the game, such as how when you go forwards and press the C key you can do a combat roll, which is very useful actually when you're fighting against lightsaber wielding opponents, and especially when you're in a situation where you're having a shit ton of rockets fired at you in the single player. It's more so useful, to be honest, in the combat in the single player, because combat in multiplayer is by and large quite unpredictable. Now, another sort of thing I should also mention actually is with explosives, their alternate fire can be very fickle, so when you experiment with them, try to be a little bit more careful, because you may end up completely fucking yourself over. In any case, I think that's enough for the base mechanics and the single player, so we'll get on to the multiplayer and have a little chat about that. Now, of course, here we come on to the multiplayer, which by and large is probably the place I should recommend you start off with first. If you want to get more so into the game mechanics, then start off with the single player. If you just want to have a bit of a fuck around with some of the weapons and customization, start off with the multiplayer. As you can see, of course, here I'm starting off by changing the default name to something a bit more appropriate. But there really is a massive amount of customization in the multiplayer mode, with about 40 or so different skins, and even then there's a few more with the customizational profile screen, and it really pays off to just have a bit of a fuck around in this mode, because as you can see here there's multiple different kinds of fighting styles with different types of saber types and different hilts and colours to just experiment with. So I would say if you're one of the more type of people who is more accustomed to this kind of gameplay, then maybe start off with the multiplayer first. However, I probably would still argue that it should be wiser to start off with the single player, just to get used to the game mechanics, particularly for people who are newer to this kind of genre. Now, when you join a lobby, actually, in multiplayer, I should mention that it works on kind of the similar sort of basis that the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare did, where you sort it by players, type, ping, and map name and server name. So just keep that in mind. It's not always going to sort of automatically link you to the most appropriate map. So, pick it out, explore a bit. It's kind of, that's kind of what the multiplayer is built upon. It's a treasure trove of modding and customization, and some of the maps you will find to be a bit more modded from their standard counterparts in multiplayer, and especially from their standard templates in the single player mode. So feel free to explore a bit, feel free to be a bit crazy, a bit outgoing when you're going into multiplayer, because God only knows there is a lot of shit to do in multiplayer, especially on some of the more modded servers. And considering that sometimes you won't be always surrounded by friendly people, shall we say, in the multiplayer, I would say it's more than wise to get used to pretty much everything as much as you can in multiplayer. Like in the single player, I would say just have a little sort of try around, don't take yourself too seriously, and just get used to the standard mechanics and nature of multiplayer first before you really get into it. I mean, I suppose that also goes with saying with most games, but it really does pay off with this game, because it's a very sort of blunt-nosed, sort of straightforward game in its base mechanics, and that's not really a bad thing in regards to Jedi Academy, because it really pays off with its simplicity, and I really can't say much else bad about it. Like I said, the game is a bit outdated in certain areas, and the dialogue and graphics aren't really what they once appeared to be, but this game is remarkable for what it achieved at the time in 2002-2003. If you have the chance, I would definitely recommend buying this. If you can see it on offer, snap it up most immediately. And, as always, I've been Gitbag the Great. I hope you enjoyed this game review as much as I did making, recording and editing it, and narrating over it, of course. And until next time, stay safe, have fun with whatever you're doing, don't do anything I wouldn't do, and until next time, I'll see you guys on the battlefield.